Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the day 2 of our international conference, Roadmap to a Safe Environment in Syria. As we all know, we had an extremely rich day of conversations yesterday, and I'm sure that the 2 sessions that we have today will prove equally as relevant and rich, including hopefully this session. As in the previous session that I moderated, I will very briefly introduce the speakers in this session, and you can find their, I have to say, impressive biographies on our website for more detail. This session is also slightly different from those from yesterday because we have 2 members who are joining us remotely, and they are Qutaiba Al-Idlibi, who is Senior Fellow and Head of the Syria project at Atlantic Council. Hello, Qutaiba. Can you hear us well?
Hello, thank you for having me. Yes, good morning.
Thank you for joining us. We know that the time difference may be slightly difficult to overcome, but thank you so much for being with us today. And also Dr. Yasser Alaiti, who is a member of the Syrian Association for Citizens' Dignity and is speaking from the north of Syria. Dr. Yasser, welcome, and thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you. Good morning.
We also have with us here in Geneva, Dr. Talal Sumbuli, who is the founder of Syrian American Council and a member of Board of Advisors. Welcome, Dr. Talal. And we have Paul Seals, who is Director of Peace Practice and Innovation at the European Institute for Peace, whom you've already met yesterday as he moderated the session in the afternoon, well, actually late morning. So the session today, I think, is extremely important in terms of its substance, and it is safe environment in Syria and the political process overcoming the paralysis. I'm not going to take any time to introduce the topic, except to say that what we are seeing in discussions yesterday, we actually came to this joint conclusion that what we are seeing in terms of ideas on the table for the political process at present, after we had years of the so-called baskets and then the Constitutional Council process, the ideas on the table now and initiatives that we are seeing are actually the result of the paralysis, rather than in fact trying to achieve any tangible solutions to overcome the paralysis and arrive at the solutions, especially the solutions that the Syrians themselves, especially displaced Syrians themselves, are communicating. So I'm sure that in the course of this session we will have plenty of opportunity to discuss this in more detail and address what could be the way out and what could be the ways to disrupt this political paralysis. But it is clear, and it is clear from the conversations we had yesterday, that it is about the political will of key countries, including the United States, the European Union, Turkey, and others, in order to reset the political process and place the concerns of displaced Syrians captured in the Safe Environment document at the top of the political agenda. I will, without further ado, turn to Kutaiba first in the United States, who has also served as the ambassador for what is known as the opposition in the United States, to tell us from his understanding, from his experience, what will it take for the key states like the United States to recognize the interest, their interest and urgency of engaging in the work, difficult work that needs to be done in order for safe environment to be elevated to the top of political agenda and then subsequently achieved.
Thank you so much, Rizk. I'll start quickly by just describing the situation we're in today and how, very quickly how we got to where we are today. I mean, to summarize, after 10 years, over 10 years of the conflict itself, of course, we've got to a situation where it was hard to manage an agreement with Iran and Russia on getting out of the conflict on one hand, but also other priorities raised, whether conflicts in the Horn of Africa, the conflict in Ukraine, and of course what we see with the brutal economic recession that is looming across Europe and the United States. That is kind of the general conditions usually used to justify the lack of engagement, the paralysis that we see in the engagement on the Syrian political process. But more specifically, I think we are where we are today because, in a sense, since probably 2014 or 2015, there was a lack of political interest in engaging meaningfully and finding a solution for the conflict. I think, since the beginning of the conflict, there was an assumption that among Syrian and among Western officials that it is only a matter of time for the Assad regime to fall, that this process, whether it is the fall of the Assad regime, the transition to a new political body, to a new political system in Syria, requires a certain level of engagement, but doesn't require heavy political and otherwise investment by the international community. Of course, the intervention of Russia, heavy intervention of Russia and Iran later proved otherwise. I'm worried today with kind of like the shifting priorities that we have, with the opportunity that the situation in Syria created for countries like Iran, like Russia, like China, to try to challenge international norms, to challenge specifically the United States over the space in the Middle East. I'm worried that it will take a lot of damage to Western interests, especially the interests of the United States, for the US government to kind of wake up to the reality of our vacuum that we are leaving in Syria for Russia and Iran. I wouldn't be, I think, generalizing or overestimating the impact of the Syrian conflict to say that what we see in Ukraine today is a result of our lack of serious engagement in Syria. What we see on the JCPOA, the nuclear deal, and the lack of engagement, serious engagement from Iran to kind of like get the JCPOA over the cross line is a result of our engagement with Iran on Syria. And our serious challenge, the challenge of the United States with China today, is also a result of the over expression of US withdrawal from the region. So on one level, again, I worry that it would take a huge damage to the national security interest in many forms, whether it is in the forms of a big threat to the national security interest as a terrorist group, or another break of one of the international norms that were built after World War II for especially the United States and Europe to kind of like wake up to the crisis we have in Syria today. On a practical level, in terms of what we can do, just so we're not stuck in the same paralysis, I think after 12 years of almost 12 years of the conflict, as the situation have changed on the ground, it is necessary on our side, on the side of Syrians, to kind of shift gears in terms of priorities and short-term goals. It was, in the first years of the conflict, I think there was a clear path or a natural path that many Syrian groups, political and otherwise, kind of rallied around supporting, a slow but potential political transition in Syria. That opportunity is frozen for now. The situation on the ground is very different. We have 3 or 4 different areas of control. But also we have kind of a frozen front lines between those different areas. So there is a serious requirement for, I think, Syrians with their civil society, political groups, to kind of rethink the priorities for the time being and how they can utilize the opportunities on hand to make sure that they maintain the leverage they have on the ground. They maintain also the political leverage they have in the political process. Because in a sense, also maintaining the same short-term objectives that we had in 2011 and 2012, and kind of surrendering to this paralysis, is increasing the Assad regime, Iran and Russia's leverage in the political process. Because the more they are able to destroy that process or freeze that process without an alternative, again, we see that the international community, specifically in the EU and the United States, are kind of limiting their engagement to the only available options that are focusing on the long-term goal of the political process. This is the time, I believe, where it is necessary for Syrians to rally around leveraging, the territory, the international support, the human capital they have, specifically in northern Syria, to build on that, especially in terms of building a model for Syrians on what a future Syria would look like. What do Syrians want a post-Assad Syria to look like? I think in terms of practical, again, in terms of action items or practical engagement, this is kind of what it would take for providing practical options, again, for the EU and the United States to engage again when the political will comes back.
Very quickly, Kutaiba, a follow-up question. Yesterday, we heard that that the conversations that are taking place, for instance, around the step-for-step initiative right now, have not included Syrians yet, as was stated. There is a clear absence of a strong Syrian voice, especially representing displaced Syrians, as one of the key problems for any hope for a political solution, being the fate of 13 million displaced, who form the majority of the population. How can we achieve that representation? How can we achieve that the voice of Syrians is taken seriously and actually, as you said, not only participates in the discussion, but sets the agenda for the discussion?
Yes, I think mainly, especially on the step-for-step process, the process itself has been kind of absent from the public sphere conversation in terms of what does the step-for-step process really outline. Of course, in principle, the step-for-step process started in 2012, the Kerry-Lavrov conversations. That's when we really got into that process. I think the main issue we're facing today is that there is no clear outline on what the step-for-step process really implies. Even though the contact group, the small group focusing on Syria, have requested an outline for that process since the beginning of this year. But still kind of the absence of clarity on what those steps look like, how do we verify that the regime will comply, what's the nature of those steps are. It really creates, you know, a wall around this process that limits Syrians' engagement around it. On our side, I think that's why it's important for Syrians to really be on the offensive on that front line rather than on the defensive. So, for example, I think for a very impactful engagement around the step-for-step process is to really limit it to very small steps of the same nature and focused on specifically just improving the intraconnectivity around services provided to Syrians to improve their daily life. If there will be any serious engagement around that process, I think this is the only way to engage, but also to test, which is most importantly, how serious the Assad regime is in really providing any concessions. The special envoy, the UN special envoy, Sir Geir Pedersen, in his latest tour delivered the message that the Assad regime considered the latest release of detainees that happened back in April as a step, as a confidence building measure, and he was waiting, and that the Assad regime is waiting for the international community to respond back to that step. And I think this is kind of like the dangerous territory where Syrians need to be clear on that. We cannot exchange hostages with political concessions. We cannot, you know, exchange the lives of, you know, Syrians with the future of all Syrians. It needs to be very clear to the Assad regime, to political bodies who are involved in that process. And I think it's important to also realize that Syrians have allies around that process. From my conversations with member states of the contact group, there is an agreement that, again, if there is any engagement on the four-step process, it needs to be on practical steps that alleviate the human suffering on the Syrian level. But also they need to be small, measurable, of the same nature. And most importantly, to find a way to verify how the regime would comply with those steps, especially as you described in the absence of a political pressure. I think one example that many member states and Syria watchers and thinkers are aware of is the example of the chemical weapons agreement that was signed in 2013. And still with the existence of massive political pressure at the time, with all options on the table, the Syrian regime, the Assad regime, still failed to comply with that agreement. They still used chemical weapons tens of times after signing the agreement. We still have information that they are maintaining stockpiles of different chemical agents that would be used in chemicals. So that's why it is really important, you know, for Syrians first and for the international community to support Syrians to actually outline and identify the political process that would help them to create that safe, calm, and neutral environment described in your report.
Thank you. Dr. Yasser, I want to hear from you, and I think that substantively and symbolically it is very important that you are in Syria, as I asked you this. We heard yesterday, we continue hearing this from Syrians, that they perceive these different initiatives that we just discussed with Qutaiba and other similar ad hoc approaches as this glacier of normalization with the Syrian regime that is being driven by inertia in actually taking on the difficult work, but necessary work to arrive at a political agreement on the safe environment. What would you say, from your perspective, where you are now, is the impact of such creeping normalization of the Syrian regime?
Thank you very much. Good morning. Thank you for having me in this conference. I was living in Damascus. 10 years ago, I was displaced from my home, and now I'm living in northern Syria. I just want to start with little story, human story. I think it's a story of millions of Syrians. During the last 10 years, I was talking to my mother, living in Damascus, nearly every other day. And always she was asking me, Yasser, when this conflict is going to end? And I was telling her, soon, inshallah. 6 months ago, my mother was very ill, and she was talking to me hardly beneath her oxygen mask. At the end of the call, she told me, Allah ma'ak, God bless you. 2 hours after this call, she was died. This is just one of millions of painful stories of 13 million Syrian refugees and displaced like me. Why I couldn't be, and this is the point I want to make it clear, why we are as Syrians, and we don't take this step-by-step approach very seriously. I will tell you why. Why I couldn't be in Damascus with my mother in her last days. Before answering this question, I want to share you this picture. Give me just one moment. I think many of you see this picture. This was a report from Guardian newspaper about 5 months, I think, ago. I cannot go back to Damascus because men like this man still in their positions till now. I think many of you see the video released by Guardian 5 months ago about Tadamun massacre, which was committed in 2013 by this man called Amjad Youssef. The video showed with the clear photos and sounds Amjad pushing civilians into large hole and shooting them in cold blood. 41 civilians were killed in Tadamun massacre, and there were women and children among them. And this was just one of 12 massacres committed by Amjad Youssef, according to Guardian. And a recent report, just if we are talking about step-for-step approach, a recent report just 2 weeks ago from Guardian showed that Amjad Youssef is still serving in his position as security official in Kafar Sousa neighborhood in Damascus. And you can imagine how many criminals still in their official positions in Syria. I will stop sharing this picture. Okay, so you can imagine how many criminals still in their positions in Syria, not to mention the head of them, Bashar al-Assad, who is officially the commander of Syrian army and the commander of security forces, and who is personally responsible for all crimes committed by his regime since the start of revolution on March 2011. Ladies and gentlemen, the concrete steps and measures defined by roadmap for safe environment prepared by Syrian Association for Citizen Dignity would guarantee that criminals like Amjad Youssef will not allow to commit more crimes, and would guarantee the safe and voluntary return of millions of refugees and displaced Syrians. Furthermore, and this is the point here about what we can do to push or to make a political process, to get political process out of the paralysis. This is our topic. This roadmap will facilitate the political transition in Syria, according to Security Council Resolution 2254. What I want to demonstrate here is the dangers of the current tries of some countries to drive the normalization with Assad regime and legitimization of the unsustainable status quo where Syrians continue to suffer displacement, repression, torture, and enforced disappearance. Any normalization with Assad regime without taking concrete steps from him toward making a safe environment will encourage his regime to put more obstacles in the road of political process and will prolong the current situation in Syria, which invokes more violence, more terrorism, and more immigration. And this will contribute to destabilization, not just for countries around Syria, but it will contribute to destabilization around the world. This is my point of view. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Yasser. I'll come back to you, but from what you just said, I will go to Dr. Talal to ask him, I think one of the crucial questions which has been crystallized over the last day and this morning, and that is to be heard, to be able to actively affect the political process. There has to be a critical mass of displaced Syrians coming together around this idea. What will it take to create this critical mass?
Thank you very much for the question and for having participate of this important session. It will be imperative for us to look back at the history of Syrian for the last 60 years, and that will make it easier for us to understand why the Syrians think this way and what we anticipate their response to what we have at this point for a plan of action. The issue with Syria, as we all know, it's not in the last 12 years, it's for the last 60 years. And this has been enduring for all those many years between children, families, mothers, and fathers. And even went with the Syrian to whatever place they have left to settle, running away from the government.
Yeah, good. Translation issue.
Okay. Running away from the government. And this subjugation has been done in a way that we never been able to look around and see if there's any other country in the area who will do that except for North Korea. It is, I remember, if you remember, there's a book was written by Elizabeth Buden in University of Chicago, when we're talking about the kingdom of fear, and which when she described as the way the regime has been able to subjugate the human structure to a non-human entity that will be to have to follow what's being told to do, irrespective what the order is, because they have no alternative to that order. This situation went with the Syrian even after they left outside. And I'm talking United States. I've been living in the United States for the last 50 years. And after Bashar al-Assad came to power in 2001, trying to open up to the Syrian everywhere, he sent Buthayna Sha'ban and Imad Mustafa for what we call a town hall meeting in area where Syrians were used to gather, big cities as usual for foreigners, or after that, newcomers. And in fact, he came, Imad Mustafa, and I had more than one session with him, but it's not the time to speak about that. He came with Buthayna Sha'ban, which is the advisor of Bashar al-Assad, to present the new picture of the regime to the Syrian in Chicago area, a town hall meeting that never happened in Syria. So the Syrian, when they came to Chicago, they felt the sense, the smell of freedom, and they felt free to talk. Obviously, that's known. And one of the lady was standing up and she talked to Buthayna Sha'ban. She's talking about her son. Her son was taken to prison, he was tortured, and he died. And she stood up and told Buthayna Sha'ban, what did my son do to be taken, to be imprisoned, to be tortured, and to be killed? Why did you do that? And Buthayna Sha'ban started talking about variety of things, Muhammad al-Fadil and Muhammad al-Fadil, there's good. She said, I'm talking about my son. He wasn't in politics. And Buthayna Sha'ban got really sick of her. And you know what she said? What they used to say to the Syrian. She said, Qadi, sit down. This is what's expected from the Syrian at the time the regime talked to them, to sit down and obey. And the lady said, I'm not sitting down. And she stood up and she continued to talk. At that time, Buthayna Sha'ban couldn't take it. She sweat. What did she do? She sat down. That when we stand up to those individuals and we have the power to stand up, they will sit down. And unless we do that at this point, we're not going to have him to sit down and listen to us. It is our responsibility here, as we are free to come here, gather and talk and discuss. Way is out of it. Yesterday, I think we put a roadmap. And I gather, and I feel, and I hope that we have an agreement that this is most probably is our best way out of this situation. It's for us now to discuss how we are going to do it. I don't control the superpower, but we could talk to them. I don't control the government of the neighborhood in the area, Turkey and otherwise, but we should talk to them. But whom do I control? I control myself. I could talk to my friend. I could talk to the Syrian everywhere. And now that means this is our opportunity as a Syrian, as responsible, as advocate, as we have some kind of plan of action, is to go ahead and carry this plan. I'm talking about taking this seriously. You have to take it, or I have to take it, or collectively, we have to take it as the only way out of what we have. And you should consider yourself, you're responsible. There's nobody else responsible. You're responsible for it. Me, you, and everybody, collectively, and everybody we talk to them. That means we have to start from now, to sit down, calculate, set a plan of action, and be candid to ourselves with our shortcoming, with our ability, and put the best possible way out of the situation. And then we start talking to our brothers and Syrian and sisters Syrian everywhere. You're not going to talk to them from Geneva. You have to talk to them to North Syria, to South Turkey, to Jordan, to Lebanon, to Egypt, to Saudi Arabia, to England, to United States, to Germany. You have to talk to them everywhere and give them this what you have. Show it to them. Tell them this is our way out, and show them, not talk to them, show them your sincerity. You really feel your feeling. You really understand what they have. You really have it in your hand, and you have nothing else. You have no interest except their success. You don't want to be president. You don't want to be prime minister. You don't want to be a minister. You just want to be part of the process and have the dignity and the honor is to be part of the process. If we come to be as part of the process, that by itself is a great honor for all of us. I wish and I hope that all of us will be part of it, not by talking, but by action, by sitting down this evening and hopefully tomorrow and decide how we are going to do it. And each one of us will be part of it. And each one of us will be responsible that part. In a sense, like you are in a city, you're defending the city, each in a corner for it. You don't want to be taken from that corner. So you're the guard for it, and you do it. Thank you very much.
I have like a sense we should end the panel here on this note, but we will not, because there are still some questions to be asked. But this, I think, this captured the substance of all the conversations we had so far. But I will now turn to Paul, who has experience and knowledge of the processes that are going on in what we would call key states, and especially the states of the West, in their approach to Syria. And I would like to ask you, Paul, how can we explain the inertia of especially the European Union and other Western countries when it comes to Syria, and what could take to disrupt this inertia?
Well, thanks, Refik. Yes, you got the order of the panel wrong, that's for sure. But the the question, I think to try and answer that, there's 2 or 3 issues I would like to address, and some of them have already been addressed in the comments of the 3 previous speakers. How to unblock, how to re-energize, how to somehow change the perception or reality that there is a lack of creativity or imagination or progress. I'm not sure it's certainly, I don't think, a lack of effort. I think people are trying and thinking hard about these issues, but they're certainly not a record of success. That much is very, very obvious. Why have we got to this stage, and what can be done about it? I think what you said earlier on is an interesting and potentially important observation. The track record of the attempts to resolve the situation over the last 6 or 7 years, at least, as you indicated. We've had the 4 baskets approach, we've had the Constitutional Committee approach. A couple of you have already spoken this morning about the step-for-step approach, all of which by definition are effectively a continually narrowing of the path, which in itself indicates a degree of at least a concession to what is assumed to be the reality. And I think one of the questions is whether or not the description of that reality has been accurate. And I think it was Khutaiba, I can't remember if it was Khutaiba that was saying it earlier this morning. There are a number of, I think, kind of contradictions in positions that are informing the general approach that are understandable but complicate the clarity of vision. On the one hand, there is the repeated mantra that the territorial integrity of the country must be maintained. Yet, as I think it was Khutaiba that was saying, the reality is that the lines are frozen in at least 3 or 4 areas, have been for quite some time, and any of the proposals that are on the table or have been on the table have been manifestly unable to change that situation. So we have a number of issues that seem to contradict themselves in terms of approach and efforts. In terms of the situation regarding European states, and I think it's important not to just put it in the context of the European Union. The Union itself has efforts and delegations and everything else, but of course there are a number of key countries that are not in the Union who are very much engaged and affected by this issue, including Norway and the UK on a number of different levels, and Switzerland. So I think it's important to see some of this from the point of view also of member states, and not just through an EU lens, although that is also important. I think, if I can use a phrase that is well known to some of you, that there is a spectre haunting Europe, and that spectre is immigration and refugees, and has been for some time. And we know for a fact, of course, that the issue of refugees has been an enormously important, some would say the tipping point in elections and in the political discourse in a number of countries for a period of time. And we all know what the reaction was in the context of the refugee situation in 2015 and the results of that in various countries in Europe after that large inflow, if you like, around that time. And I think that raises a question. Obviously, we're all talking here about how to deal with what is the roadmap, what is the focus that is being presented here. It's about refugees and IDPs finding a way to return to Syria through the doorway of a calm, safe and neutral environment. And what are the means of establishing that? If we want states to unlock their energy and refocus their energy, I think there perhaps has to be a recalibration of the way in which some states are perhaps estimating their interests and concerns. And one has to be careful about that, because the people that are trying to do this are, of course, bright people and smart people, and I imagine doing their best, of course. But one of the things that has obviously been the case is that for a long time there has been a fairly significant assumption that the problem can be contained, that the issue of the potential refugee crisis can be contained, that there is a relatively infinite capacity of, I don't think you can have something relatively infinite, an infinite capacity of the willingness of neighbouring countries in particular to host the millions that are and have been staying in their countries for several years. And all of you in the room know that that is very far from the truth and is increasingly less and less the truth. And even if some of the worst case scenarios, as we heard yesterday, may be overplayed for the purposes of political campaigning, that is small comfort for the people facing those campaigns at the moment and who are making life decisions to flee some of their host countries precisely because of the political context that they're currently living in. So I think there's an issue, there's a question to ask, particularly you're asking about, I think, European states. Is that calculation that seems to have been made still holding? Can it hold? How much longer can it hold? The conflict, as Qutaiba, I think, was saying in the first intervention today, is certainly frozen along various lines, but the political situation in host countries is fluid and is changing and is dynamic and is going in a direction that is not positive for the conditions for the people that we're talking about. And that raises, I mean, we heard from the UNHCR yesterday, and the position that the colleague tried to put forward was that they are advocating for ever more support, ever more funds, ever more political energy to accommodate and host the people in those countries. But even he indicated that is a losing battle at this point. So I think one of the questions is really for those states is to calculate more or to revisit that calculation and revisit their own interests, because the challenge of getting that wrong and misunderstanding the real threat of failing to deal with the opportunity that's provided, particularly by this paper and the calm, safe and neutral environment, is a way of solving what is a very direct and massive, some would say existential political threat to a number of European governments. And I know there are enormous difficulties in European countries for trying to do that, but I think there ought to be a perception that there is an increasing risk of presuming that this can be contained or simply funded a way out of. So that's one area I think is a crucial element of trying to understand a little bit differently the questions of how states might engage in this process. And I think just to finish on this point, the issue around the what the paper's trying to do. We've talked about this for a long, long time and have discussed the way in which the issue of refugees and IDPs is either not understood or minimized or deprioritized, and has been, I think, for a long, long time. And even when we started doing this work several years ago, that always struck me as quite a strange situation, in the sense that what we've all said in the last couple of days very clearly, we all know that over half of the population is in one of those two conditions. And it's a fairly astonishing situation that the voice and the interests of those constituencies have not been a much more significant focus of efforts. I don't say they've been entirely dismissed, but they have certainly not been a significant focus of effort. Or at least they become a significant focus of effort in moments of crisis to address political problems elsewhere. So I think there is an effort that can be made, and I think this opportunity that's presented by the report and by this series of discussions over today and yesterday to refocus and re-energize efforts in that direction. I think the comments that have already been made this morning are very, very interesting, very indicative of an understanding that this provides a different doorway, if you like, a different way to enter the problem. And I think the thing that I took from yesterday's meeting that I think is important to present to people who are trying to find new ways and creative ways of addressing the problem is that this does not try, as far as I can see, to pretend that I kind of commented on this yesterday a little bit, the paper itself and the content of the paper does not seem to me to be naive or to pretend to present a comprehensive solution and a pathway to a utopia. That's not what this paper is doing. It is very much focused on addressing a very specific issue with some very practical problems. It is so far from academic. It's both encouraging and important to acknowledge that. It's very practical and it's very concrete, and is based on the reality of the experiences and the desires and interests of the people most directly affected by the issue. And I think the important issue for me is that understanding that what is being asked for and what is being suggested is, as I say, a doorway of some description that you can rely on, that is predictable enough in order to get to the situation you were talking about yesterday, i.e. people taking advantage and having confidence in the framework that could be created as a result of something like this approach, have enough confidence to go back without pretending that they would go back without risk and without danger. There will be risk and danger. So I think that it's important to recognize that there is this paper, and this forum offers a new bit of enlightenment, a new course that could be charted, and that actually could potentially be very much in the interests of those states, particularly in Europe, that have a very, very direct and vested interest in ensuring that this issue, particularly of the 6 million or so refugees, but also the IDPs, is addressed in a long-term and sustainable way. So that's where I would focus on that.
Let me just ask briefly a follow-up question before we open up to discussion and go back to also our speakers on Zoom. But I have to ask you, I absolutely agree with you that it is astonishing that this huge constituency of 13 million people is seen, first of all, is not seen, or is seen as some abstract, amorph mass that only exists as a number, and not as 13 million constituents, human beings, people who have rights. Is it the issue of dehumanization? Is it the issue of language? Is it that we are seeing interest in Ukraine at the level that it is not only because of strategic importance of that conflict, but also in the way that Ukrainians were able to communicate their cause? Is this an element of the problem, do you think? Because we are not, in fact, communicating the extent, the dimension, and the implications of the problem in the right way.
I always hate beginning an answer to any kind of question by saying it's complicated, because we all know that, and it's rather redundant. But if one is to answer that question, there are various layers, and part of it is what you're saying, I think, but it's also, to me, there's 3 or 4 different things. I started one of the first jobs I did. I was a lawyer for refugees in my own country in Scotland, and trying to get their plight taken seriously by the government in question at the time. And every refugee lawyer around the world will tell you it's the same problem. It's such a marginal constituency in terms of its political power, and such a powerful constituency in terms of the way politicians can use it for their own ends. So it's a very curious mix in some ways of the almost the weakest people by definition in the capacity to exercise influence and power, are also almost the most instrumentalized in certain kinds of political discourses. And that's a curious issue to me. The question about why, I think there's a number of things, and one of the things that we have had conversations about over many years, the very nature of the status of being a refugee or an IDP in the conditions that the 6 or 7 million people in Syria are, by definition, marginalizes and silences their capacity to act. They are removed from their homes, removed from their families, removed from their networks, even to the extent that they can connect or re-energize themselves to that. It's an enormous struggle to do so. So there is a very natural phenomenon of marginalization and silencing. So that side of it is I think, almost however unpleasant, is part of the phenomenon of being a refugee or being, if you like, chronically displaced for such a long period of time. So that side of it is there, and trying to help facilitate a way in which that community or that constituency can have a voice, you all know in this room much more than me, is just an enormous challenge. So I think that's why this community has to try and do that and create that voice, because even if the people who were engaged in trying to find a solution to the conflict in terms of the states and the international community, that's a task that's beyond them, frankly speaking. That even if they had the will to do it, I don't think they have the means or the time or the energy given their other constituencies. The terms of what happens, why a different treatment in Ukraine to Syria is, I think, an interesting question, but it's more complicated, I think, than just an assessment of, they were European and blonde-haired and blue-eyed or whatever else, and Syrians aren't. Because if you look at the international reaction going back to 2014 and the acceptance in relation to the Crimean situation, the international community was prepared to accept that. And even the situations in Donetsk and Luhansk, to a position, they were prepared to accept that. There was a tipping point. So yes, there's definitely a difference in the tipping point issue, and the tipping point in Ukraine has provoked a reaction of, frankly speaking, an existential nature in Europe, or almost an existential nature, both in Europe and the US. And simply speaking, Syria does not represent the same strategic interest to them. I think it's probably more along those lines, but I don't doubt there are other aspects to it.
Dr. Talal, and then I'll open up for discussion before going back to Dr. Yasser and Qutaiba.
We shouldn't forget at the same time that the regime from 2013 with the Iranian and other power in the area manufacture what we call now is Daesh and somehow found Al-Qaeda. We know as Syrian, for generation, century, they are modest individual. And extremism is very, very unusual. It's alien to that area. No, Bilad al-Sham is alien to that area, and all of us, we know that this is not from Bilad al-Sham, has nothing to do with Bilad al-Sham. So there was an intention of making the refugee as devils from the first time. When they move, when they go running away, the suspicion that they're being Daesh is twined with them. And this is one of the reasons and I understand it, not because it was for the European and the Turk, it was a real one, because there was many events happen in France, in Germany, and so forth. So it was real, and there's nothing will make the normal, regular individual in Germany or otherwise not to suspect that one of the terrorists will be one of them. So that makes it more difficult for the refugee to be able to felt and looked at as a refugee. In addition to that, we didn't find anyone to defend the refugee, not those representative for the refugee, nor the countries what we call as friends of the Syrian. We found nobody to represent them and defend them.
Yeah, so many questions that I have, but I will open it to discussion. We have a question here. Dr. Hala, also, please, if you are following online, feel free to send your questions in and we will ask them. Please.
صباح الخير. أنا أريد أن أخاطب الصديق بول، وأنا أسمعه يعني كنت أشعر أنني أمام نموذج لمواطن أوروبي في حقيقة الأمر هو يحاول أن يعالج مشكلتين وليس مشكلة واحدة. المشكلة الأولى هي التي عنوناها هنا في هذا المؤتمر، وهي قضية البيئة الآمنة وعودة اللاجئين، أو يعني قضية اللجوء بشكل عام، ولكنه أضمر في نفسه، وهذا طبيعي. وللعلم أنا مواطن أوروبي أيضا، يعني كما كل المواطنين الأوروبيين، والحكومات الأوروبية لديهم مشكلة كبيرة. وفي فن التفاوض الذي ندرسه للطلبة في الجامعة، عندما تريد أن تنجح في قضية تفاوضية، عليك في وقت من الأوقات أن تضع نفسك مكان الآخر، وأن تحاول أن ترى بعينيه المشكلة. لذلك أنا أريد أن أقول للصديق بول وبمحبة واحترام أن المشكلة في حقيقة الأمر هي ليست مشكلتين، بل هي مشكلة واحدة وليستا مشكلتين. أنا أعرف تماما أن في كثير من الدول الأوروبية الآن هناك فصائل سياسية وأحزاب سياسية جديدة قادمة على الساحة، وهناك نوع من الرأي العام الذي يتصف بالجزئية وليس العمومية، تحت عنوان We don't care، يعني لا علاقة لنا، باللهجة السورية ما دخلنا. وهذه حالة خطيرة للغاية. إذا كبرت وتنامت وأصبحت ذات قرار سياسي، ونحن لا أريد أن أسمي الدول، أنتم تعرفونها، التي أصبحت هناك فيها حكومات يعني تريد صد اللاجئين وبطريقة عنيفة، وهناك مشاهد شاهدناها في جنوب بلغاريا واليونان إلى آخره. لماذا يحصل كل هذا؟ يحصل كل هذا لأننا لم نعالج المشكلة الأصلية يا كرام يا محترمين، لأننا على طول الخط وخلال العقد الفائت كله كنا لا يعني نتعاطى، والأسباب ربما يعرفها المطلعون، يعني لا نتعاطى مع القضية السورية في حقيقة الأمر في أسها الرئيسي، في مكانها الرئيسي، وهي أن هناك نظام مستبد حول دولة بكاملها وشعب كامل يعتبر هو الحضارة الإنسانية. أنا أقولها بكل فخر كسوري، أصلا أنا سوريا هي الحضارة الإنسانية، حولها إلى مزرعة. طيب، ألم يكن هناك بالإمكان خلال هذا العقد الكامل من الزمن أن يكون هناك مواقف حقيقية من الاتحاد الأوروبي تحديدا. أنا الآن أتحدث عن أوروبا لأنني أنظر إلى أوروبا بالمعنى التاريخي والمعنى الحضاري الحالي، وأنا أشعر بالأسى على أوروبا بصراحة. أنا أشعر بالأسى لأن أوروبا في حقيقة الأمر بدأ التنوير منها، بدأ العقد الاجتماعي منها، هوبس وروسو وراسل وكل هؤلاء الفلاسفة. فماذا تفعل الآن أوروبا؟ وأين هو الموقف الأوروبي الحقيقي الذي يؤثر حقيقة بشكل حقيقي على أرض الواقع في مستقبل العالم؟ أقول لكم شيئا آخر قد لا ينتبه إليه الكثيرون. تحدثت أنا مع الصديق الدكتور سمير في هذا الموضوع. مصر 100 مليون إنسان، قد تنفجر مصر أيضا، انتبهوا. يعني ما نراه الآن من موجات لاجئين قد تكون يعني بداية كما يقولون عندنا أول الرقص حنجلة، لا أعرف كيف سوف يترجمونها، يعني آسف. قد تنفجر مصر وهي 100 مليون إنسان. أتعرفون ماذا يعني هذا الأمر؟ فرانسوا ميتران له كتاب رائع جدا، هذا الرجل كان عبقري على فكرة، اسمه الشمال والجنوب. قال بالحرف الواحد في ثمانينيات القرن الماضي: إذا لم تقدم أوروبا على الاستثمار الحقيقي في إفريقيا والشرق الأوسط، انتظروا أن لا نعرف هوية حقيقية لأوروبا في المستقبل. وكان يتحدث ليس فقط عن الشكل، شكل أوروبا والدول الأوروبية، بل عن المضمون أيضا. يعني هو مبدأ فيزيائي يا كرام، ولن أطيل كثيرا. موجات الهجرة مبدأ فيزيائي، بمعنى أن هنا قد حدث فراغ حقيقي، فراغ أمني، فراغ غذائي، فراغ دوائي، لا مشافي، ظلم، قهر، اعتقال. ماذا تتوقعون؟ طيب، ألا يجب أن تعود أوروبا مرة أخرى لكي تكون قوة حقيقية في السياسة الدولية؟ من هنا تبدأ كل القصة، لأن من يتحكمون بالقرار العالمي اليوم لا يكترثون لمعاناة أوروبا. رسالتي الآن أيضا كمواطن أوروبي الآن لكل الحكومات الأوروبية والاتحاد الأوروبي وكمواطن سوري قبل كل شيء: عودوا لكي تصبحوا قوة أساسية على الكرة الأرضية، لأننا نحترم تاريخكم، لأننا نحترم التنوير الذي بدأ من أوروبا. إذا لم يحصل هذا الأمر توقعوا آلاف المشاكل من هذا النوع، وربما تكون هذه فقط بدايات. شكرا.
Thank you. Dr. Khala.
شكرا جزيلا على الجلسة. أود أن أضيف أن آليات تعامل أو دعني أقل بكلمة أخرى، فقدان التناسق بين الهدف والرؤية لمنظمات الأمم المتحدة وللفاعلين الدوليين بالقضية السورية وبين الأدوات والإجراءات التي يقومون بها بشأن القضية السورية سببت تجزئة كبيرة بالآليات التي انبثقت لحل القضية السورية. ما زالت هناك موجات لجوء، موجات هجرة، ما زال الوضع الإنساني مستمر في التدهور، ما زال ناس معتقلون، لم يتم تحقيق تقدم ملحوظ على مسار العدالة. لذلك أعتقد أن المقاربة الشاملة المتكاملة التضمينية لكل الفاعلين هو شيء مهم. أنا هنا أرجو أو أشجع أن يأخذوا بعض الوقت كل الفاعلين، كل المهتمين بالشأن السوري ويعتقدون أنفسهم أنهم فاعلين، بما فيها آليات الأمم المتحدة، السياسيين، دول الجوار، أن يأخذوا بعض الوقت للنظر إلى ورقة البيئة الآمنة لسوريا، قد تعطي الكثير من الحلول ورسم حل متكامل لسوريا. أنا أدرك هناك تحديات وظروف محيطة قد تعقد هذا الوضع، ولكن طالما حل صدر من السوريين من الممكن الاعتماد عليه بشكل كبير. شكرا.
Thank you very much for this very successful conference, which we are very much informed from various voices and different ideas. And I am further believe that although I didn't have a full coverage of the report, but the summary I had, I am very pleased to see that many of the aspects of this paper are overlapping, I mean, similar to papers which we have produced last August under the title Political State Wisdom and National Conscience of Turkey, and with the proposals with regards to Syrian refugees in Turkey. By the way, let me clearly say that some voices in Turkey, some radical voices in Turkey are really marginal, and they never represent, because there were some references to Turkey yesterday, some talks. They are marginal and they never represent the general Turkish values, social values, and historical understanding. So we have to be very much clear about it. There is no question about that one. And since we are talking about the political process in this session, I am not a government official. But by the way, let me tell you, it is really tragic and it is really pity that almost all the actors to this political solution process under the umbrella of UN are at odds with each other. There is no single two actors which are coinciding as vis-a-vis their policies, even Iran and Russia, the main culprits of the issue. And interesting, these are most unfortunate issue currently towards a political solution, but we don't have any solution. And even among historical allies like Turkey and Russia, who may, Turkey and US, who may really contribute to a political process are at odds, which we know. I mean, it is really, as I said, I am not a government official, but it is really beyond any logic, beyond any conception that how can an executive order by White House maybe is released almost every year since the last 3 years, targeting Turkey as the main source of threat for US in Syria? It's ununderstandable. Instead of working together, which are turning a real blind eye to Turkish conception of what is terrorism in northern Syria. So there should be, this is a non-starter, and with such approach, we cannot move towards any political solutions, which is really a tragic issue. But anyway, still there is no alternative to UN political process, because contrary to this one, it is that still tragedy is going on, no refugees are turning, unsafe Syria is still living, if we are not successful in this political process. So this is the only one, and that all the actors should strictly follow, because there is no other way around. Thank you very much.
Please go ahead.
Yes, so many thanks for all panelists here. Now, actually, my question for Mr. Paul, and now we know all as Syrians now, the United States is in a conflict top to top with China, and the Syrian crisis doesn't occupy for example, importance in its plans and foreign policy. Maybe a little bit, I mean, just it gave Russia the full freedom to be involved helping the Assad regime. Actually, we are wondered, and we question the EU. Now, the EU, we have no, I mean, quiet and clear vision and decision, and no determination by EU just to have positive role. And America is waging wars, and Europe, they are taking the responsibility to receive a lot of refugees. So the question really, we are looking for what is in the favor of European principles and interests too. They have to be, I mean, they have to be really more workable more practical with our crisis in Syria. And thank you very much again.
Thank you, Professor.
May I speak in Arabic? Yeah, I can speak in English, but just to make the audience more. في مرحلة معينة أنا أعتقد أننا ينبغي أن نبني تمثال لبوتين في سوريا، لأنه الحقيقة أوضح للعالم كله الإشكال الرئيسي في التركيبة وفي المنطق الاستراتيجي لأوروبا وللولايات المتحدة. طبعا حقيقة أنا أعتقد أن المشكلة الرئيسية هي بما يسمى بالإنجليزية النونشالانس أو بالفرنسية، يعني هي اللامبالاة التي ظنت فيها أوروبا أنها على أسس اقتصادية تستطيع الهرب من حقائق أنها جزء من جوار استراتيجي إقليمي وأنها تستطيع. أنا في مرحلة معينة مع شخصية كبيرة ألمانية الآن حاكمة، يعني قال لي: من تظنون، من أنتم كسوريين؟ يعني هل تظنون أن سياسات العالم سترسم على أساسكم؟ قلت له: سنرى في المستقبل. بعد سنة حين التقيت به جاء وقال لي: نعم، نحن نكتشف أنك كنت محقا. أقصد أن أقول الشيء الإيجابي الآن أن أوروبا بدأت تفكر ببعدها الاستراتيجي الذي هو جنوب المتوسط، وأنا أعتقد بأن عملنا الرئيسي هو أن نجد منصة توافق رئيسية بيننا وبين الأوروبيين لكي نبدأ في العمل. وأعتقد أن ما قام به هذا الاجتماع الآن هو منصة مهمة يمكن تطويرها. ما نحتاجه هو من أصدقائنا الأوروبيين أن يدلونا كيف يمكن أن نضع بلاتفورم مشترك أو منصة مشتركة ونبني هذه الجسور بين مصالح أوروبا وبين قضية حل مشكلة اللاجئين والمرحلين القضية الرئيسية هي أن لم يعد بالإمكان معالجة قضية اللاجئين بالقطعة ولا بالجزء. حتى لو بنيتم جداراً بينكم وبين تركيا لن تحل. وحل مشكلتكم مع تركيا كمان بعيداً عن الجانب الإيديولوجي أمر مهم جداً. هذا يجب أن نقوله بصراحة، لأن بالنتيجة في اعتقادي أن تركيا قد أثبتت قدرة، يعني أنها تحملت حمل كبير من عبء اللاجئين، ولكنها في ذات الوقت على المستوى الجيوستراتيجي هي حمت أوروبا إن لم تكن تدركون ذلك، شئنا ما بينه. ولذلك بغض النظر عن أي اعتبار أعتقد أن مفيد جدا أن يقوم أصدقائنا الأوروبيين بأن يدلونا كيف يمكن أن نجد مشتركات بين سياساتنا وبين توجهاتنا ومصالحنا بصفتنا مدافعين عن عودة اللاجئين بعيدا وعدم تصديرهم مرة أخرى. كيف يمكن أن نجعل ذلك منصة سياسية رئيسية للتحالف مع أحزاب ويوجد أحزاب يمكن أن نبني معها تحالفات. شكرا.
This, I hope that I got it right in translation, but this last point is, I think, the key. The concept, the energy, the momentum of these discussions over these last 2 days have to be turned into a political action in order for anything to be possible. 2 questions left. It is Ambassador there, and then the gentleman, and then we will turn to the lady there, sorry. And then we will turn back to the panelists. Ambassador, go ahead.
Thank you very much. Actually, I'd like to make just a few comments, 3 points, and they mostly build up on what I said yesterday. One of them is that unfortunately what we are talking about today here and for the last 11 years is a very humanitarian thing. I mean, we are going through a basic major humanitarian tragedy, and it is sometimes really shameful to talk politics over humanitarian suffering, but unfortunately that is the reality of the world. The humanitarian issue, the humanitarian aspect, unfortunately, cannot be detached from the political realities. So we have to bear in mind this particular fact. Secondly, I think any solution and any end to this suffering will definitely be a matter of pleasing different agendas and different priorities of different countries. That is another harsh reality that we need to face. And I think the most important factor here is, since yesterday everybody is talking about Syrians also being involved and Syrians are being left out. Yes, definitely, this is a Syrian problem, and in the end, it will be the Syrians who will be finding a solution to a Syrian problem. But then, unfortunately, as an insider and an outsider at the same time, what I see is that the Syrian people, the Syrian opposition, the Syrian victims, no matter what they do, are not sufficient enough to have their voices heard properly. And there is a lack of united vision, united stance, and a leadership. I mean, that is the basic obstacle preventing success of the Syrian people. Lastly, as regards Europe, Europe is a mouthpiece, if you ask me, unfortunately. You know, you may criticize Turkey, you may hail Turkey, no matter what you do, Turkey is involved. When you are involved, there are also mistakes, of course, but nobody can overlook the fact that Turkey has been providing a home to 3.7 million Syrians for the last, I don't know how many years. So that is really a big thing. As I said, there may be mistakes, there may be criticisms, but then that doesn't change the fact that Turkey has been giving a lot for the last 11 years. Europe, on the other hand, is very happy for keeping out the Syrians coming from into Europe, but that is not enough to help solve the problem. As I said yesterday, the Europeans, the European Union, are also expected to put their hands under the stone to go for the burden sharing. I mean, a contribution to the Syrian problem is not taking measures to keep Syrians away from European territory, but to make sure that the solution is found, a solution is found back at their home, and then they can go back in a dignified way, in a voluntary way. And in the meantime, to support them. Words are not enough. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Please, go ahead.
أشكر المتحدثين. أنا ليس لدي تعليق، لدي سؤال أحتاج للإجابة عليه. حقيقة سأخفف الحمل على السيد بول، وأرجو من السيد قتيبة أيضا أن يقوم بالإجابة بالتشارك. نحن نعلم جميعا بأن هناك الاتحاد الأوروبي لديه موقف باللاءات الثلاث التي يتحدث عنها من أجل الضغط على النظام للدخول في العملية السياسية، والتي تتمحور حول اللاءات الثلاث، لا لرفع العقوبات الاقتصادية ولا للتطبيع مع النظام ولا لإعادة الإعمار حتى نحصل على تقدم سياسي. ولكن مؤخرا، وهذا في سياق حديث الأستاذ قتيبة عن عملية الخطوة مقابل خطوة والغموض الذي يلفها، نعلم جميعا أن قرار تمديد المساعدات الإنسانية كان يحمل في متنه لغة تنازل جديدة من قبل الأمريكي بالتوافق مع الروسي حول موضوع إعادة التعافي. عندما توجهنا للاتحاد الأوروبي، وأخص بالذكر الألمان والفرنسيين لأن الألمان من أكثر المانحين في هذا الموضوع، نحن نعلم أن هناك مفاوضات مع النظام السوري للانفتاح على موضوع إعادة التعافي، ربما بمشاريع خدمية صغيرة، وهكذا يتحدثون. وحينها قال لي هذا المسؤول بأن نحن نتخوف دائما من موضوع الطاعون، وبعد أن حصل موضوع مرض الكوليرا أرسل بإيميل وقال: أتتذكرين ذلك الحديث الذي كنا نتخوف منه؟ يجب نحن أن نقوم بهذه العملية. نحن لا يجب أن نقوم بتسييس المساعدات، علما أن حتى المساعدات الإنسانية تم تسييسها لأنها دائما كانت تقوم على مبدأ تقاطع المصالح فيما حصل. سؤالي بالتحديد أرجو من السيد بول وأرجو من الأستاذ قتيبة أيضا، أنا لدي تصور ولكن أريد أن أسمع منكم: ألا يعتبر عملية إعادة التعافي هي جزء من خطوة مقابل خطوة، والتي أحيانا يتم تعريفها بأنها مجموعة من الخطوات التي تقوم فيها دول المجتمع الدولي بالتنازل إلى النظام من أجل دفع العملية السياسية؟ والنظام غير معني، بالعكس هو قوي ويقوم بالتفاوض. وقد ذكر السيد قتيبة بأن موضوع المرسوم والعفو اعتبر بأنه خطوة تقدم بها، علما أن مجموعة العمل الدولية التي اجتمعت في واشنطن ذكرت بأن قضية المعتقلين لن تدخل في سياق الخطوة مقابل خطوة، لأنه موضوع ما فوق تفاوضي، وهي ليست أمر واقع للدخول في هذا البازار. شكرا.
Thank you very much. And the last question from the floor, please go ahead.
يسعد أوقاتكم. يحيى مكتبي، عضو رابط كرامة مواطن. الحقيقة أنه نحن بنعرف أنه العناية المشددة في المشافي هي الأكثر كلفة، ومع الأسف الشديد طوال السنوات الماضية منذ 2011 المجتمع الدولي تعامل مع القضية السورية على طريقة
We're not getting translation. Translation? Yes, we can hear you now. Can you please repeat the question?
الحقيقة أنه كلياتنا بنعرف أنه العناية المشددة في المشافي هي الأكثر كلفة مادية، وكلنا نعلم للأسف أن طوال السنوات الماضية ومنذ 2011 تم التعامل مع المشهد السوري على طريقة لا تموت ولا تحيا، يعني وكأن هنالك قرار ضمني بعدم انتصار أي طرف من الأطراف. لكن هذا ماذا ولد؟ هذا في الحقيقة ولد مجموعة من المشاكل بدأت من داخل سوريا وانتشرت إلى الجوار وانتشرت باتجاه أطراف عالمية وبشكل خاص باتجاه الاتحاد الأوروبي. ما الذي أريد قوله؟ أنه هذه العقلية في فقط وجود إدارة للمشهد السوري لن توصلنا إلى أي مكان. يجب أن تقلب هذه المعادلة إلى وجود إرادة حقيقية وصادقة لإنهاء هذه المأساة، وإلا فإن الكلف الناتجة عن المشهد السوري سترتفع مع الزمن. وسأستعير المثل من صديقي الدكتور سمير عندما يفكر في تسكير أو تضميد الجرح على ما فيه من فيروسات وجراثيم، فإن العطب سيكبر في الجسم وليس سيتناقص مع الوقت. أيضا مع الأسف الشديد عوضا عن وجود هذه الإرادة التي نطالب بها، كانت هنالك عملية ربما مقصودة أو غير مقصودة لتمزيق قوى الثورة والمعارضة، فظهرت منصات ودخلنا في دوامات ليس لها أفق واضح على الإطلاق. اليوم السؤال الكبير الذي يطرحه معظم السوريين الموجودين في الداخل: إلى متى؟ يعني لو أن هنالك إرادة دولية حقيقية لإنهاء المشهد ونستطيع أن نخاطب أهلنا في الداخل ونقول سيكون هنالك حل مقنع مقبول بعد 2 أو 3، لا ضبط الناس أنفسهم وصبروا على معاناتهم وانتظروا هذه 2 أو 3. اليوم المشهد غير واضح، hopeless case. الأفق هو أفق مع الأسف سوداوي، وبالتالي هذا الأمر سيفرز مسألتين خطيرتين جدا. سيعزز من الفرصة لخطاب الذي يدعو إلى أفكار متطرفة وإرهابية، وفي نفس الوقت سيضاعف موضوع اللاجئين. الذي أريد أن أختم به، نحن نعلم أن ليس هنالك حلول سحرية ولا ساحرة للمشهد السوري نتيجة التعقيد الذي وصل إليه، لكن أنا أطرح، وهذا سؤال من بعض السوريين، لماذا لا يتم دعم من القوى الكبرى وخاصة الأمريكان والأوروبيين لمجموعة سورية وطنية قادرة على تقديم مشروع وطني تتحدث به على 186 ألف كيلومتر مربع وتتحدث بلسان 23 مليون سوري، وليس الحديث الذي يدار الآن في كنتونات وفي هبوط على المستوى المناطقي والإثني والديني وغيرها. هذا السؤال الكبير برسم أصدقائنا أصدقاء الشعب السوري. شكرا.
Thank you. I will now go for the last round of responses to our panelist, Dr. Yasser. I would like to ask you first, based on what you have heard, based on your experience and the fact that you have a direct insight into the dynamics inside Syria itself in the north, what do you think will it take? What is needed for Syrians to come around the concept presented in the Safe Environment document and finally create a strong voice that Dr. Talal was talking about earlier?
Yeah, actually, the international approach toward the Assad regime is put some pressure on him. If it didn't work, then leave this pressure or alleviate this pressure. Our experience as Syrians with this regime is, if you put a pressure on regime and it didn't respond, then you have to make more pressure on him. As Mr. I don't remember his name. He gave a very good example. When we stood up, the regime will listen. Will listen to us. So the impression, the impression with Syrian people here in northern Syria, that there is no seriousness regarding putting a pressure to the regime to go forward in the real political process. So they are always asking to put more pressure on him, not to alleviate pressure, not to make steps toward him that will make him more rigid and will push him to put more obstacles. This is an ambition among Syrians regarding political process. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Yasser. Qutaiba, you had a very direct question regarding step for step. Any final thoughts from you, including a question from me in relation to step for step? As we have heard, there are real concerns that engaging in such a non-transparent process, which includes concessions that we don't still know what they involve, could in fact render any future opportunity for a political agreement on the safe environment and other things impossible. Tell us your view on the impact of such ad hoc initiatives.
Absolutely. I'll start from your last questions first on what could Syrians do to kind of contextualize the concept presented in the paper. I think, from 1 to 10, we need to go back to political organization. It is time for Syrians. We've seen, of course, in the last 10 years, Syrians have been very successful in organizing themselves around civil society organizations, around victim associations, around family associations. We've seen that success in the work of the Syrian Associations for Citizens' Dignity itself, and in the work of other associations. It was mentioned in the paper, there was a talk about the UN mechanism on the forcibly disappeared in Syria. And there is also, this is also an example of the success that civil society organizations and family associations have been able to achieve. Where we have the shortcoming we have is in organizing politically. And it is important today, especially for communities, Syrian communities, to be able to organize themselves in such ways, to be able to speak up about their situation. In terms of why is that important? Because when talking about solutions, as I said, the conflict itself, the fact that the conflict is frozen means that there would be no political solution in the near future. Meanwhile, what the Assad regime, Iran and Russia are doing is they're trying to win through politics what they couldn't win militarily. So militarily, all front lines are frozen. There's no interest for Iran and Russia actually to move forward, especially in Northwest, because of agreements with Turkey, because, you know, from security perspective, it would entail taking in a large population that the regime itself considered to be hostile to itself. And that actually applies also even more to, you know, Syrian refugees, especially around the region. So moving from that fact, we know for sure that the regime is not going to be willing to engage with any process of returning refugees back to Syria. And we've seen that clearly, actually, in the last few years, regardless of the kind of like levels, the high levels of engagements that the regime was able to secure with neighboring countries in Jordan and Lebanon. We haven't seen that really reflected on any flexibility from the regime to really allow, you know, even those who are willing to go back safely and securely to Syria. I know the UNHCR has operated the, I think it's called the go and visit or check and visit trips where refugees are able to go back and check on their hometowns, check on the conditions and see if they're able to return. Yet there is no data on like people who actually went back. There's no official data on people who actually went back, but we do have reports from civil society organizations, from human rights organizations about detention and even detention, torture, and even death under torture for refugees who went back. And in some cases, we've seen death even in few weeks after coming back or returning to Syria. What would that entail? That entails that we need to start planning for longer stay in the region. From the US and EU perspective, that should entail more macro plan when engaging with the region. One very sad example I've seen in the last few weeks is, for example, the way the energy deal between Lebanon and Israel has been managed. I know this is a little bit off, topic on Syria, but for host countries, for countries who are hosting a large number of Syrian refugees, they are facing a lot of economic challenges, especially in terms of inflation and the economic crisis we're seeing today. So if there are no, if the solutions for the economic crisis those countries are going through do not include actually an aspect that addresses the issue of refugees, we're going to continue to see this issue of forced return of refugees in the region. And it is very dangerous. There are successful examples before where the international community actually rallied to make sure that refugees have better status in those countries. The Jordan Compact back in 2015, I believe, is an excellent example of improving situation for Syrian refugees in Jordan in terms of accessibility to labor markets, to job opportunities, and to a path for a more sustainable stay in Jordan. So there are examples where we were successful in engaging in regional countries to at least make sure that there are no pressure on those governments to push refugees to go back to their death in Syria. So that's on that level. It could be done on both sides, and that cannot be done again without really Syrians organizing themselves politically to be able to exert that pressure on the international communities and to be able to voice their opinions. On the early recovery and the step for step, as I mentioned, definitely the dynamic we see between the United States and Russia, especially on the cross-border today, is part of the step for step, but it is part of the Russian-American step for step process that I mentioned that Kerry and Lavrov started in 2012. The difference in the new approach is that we're talking about international community to regime step for step process. And that's where I think it gets really dangerous, because then we are talking about some sort of normalization of the regime itself. An actual beneficial step for step process, it needs to be Syrian. So when we put, for example, a question on energy, on civil registry, so for example, what would it take for the Syrian civil registry system to operate all across Syria to provide Syrians with their identification papers without having to pay high fees, without having to go through the black market that the regime has created and have really high cost on, during this economic hardship that a lot of Syrians are going through. So this is, for example, like an example of a Syrian step for step process that maybe should be encouraged, again, focused specifically on alleviating the hardship that Syrians are going through, but not really a step for step process that supports any sort of normalization or providing an international platform for the Assad regime following the crimes that they've committed throughout the last 10 years. Your last question, sorry, I missed that.
My question was in relation to step for step and the absence of transparency. Is there a danger that implementation of such an initiative that does not have a voice of Syrians involved in defining what it should cover could render any possibility of a future political agreement, political solution as impossible?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I'm falling here into the fault of repeating myself, but absolutely. Again, as long as the step-for-step process is focused on regime international community engagement or regime United States engagement, then this is a bridge that the regime is going to utilize to cancel the political process, focus on actually getting what they failed to get militarily from the international community through that process.
Thank you. This time I'm not going to make the same mistake, so I'll invite you, Paul. You had quite a few questions before I turn to Dr. Talal to close the session.
Thanks. You may have to help me because I noted down some of them. Some of them I think were more observations or slight differences of opinion, which is absolutely fine. We don't all have to necessarily formulate things the same way. The issue that strikes me, there's two or three things that I think I might say, maybe not answering directly all of the issues that were raised, but one issue I want to address your dehumanization question again very briefly, because I may have either slightly misunderstood it or answered it in a way that I would correct, because as Dr. beside me was saying, there has been an issue around the way in which refugees have been portrayed, but I would be careful to emphasize that this is not just in the context of the Syrian war. Countries in Europe, as I indicated, I started working as a refugee asylum lawyer in 1993, long before this conflict. And one of the issues that we faced was yes, the dehumanization of asylum seekers, or at least the delegitimization of asylum seekers. And this wasn't just in the UK, it was throughout I don't mean necessarily by the governments, I mean in popular discourse, in tabloid newspapers, all of the rest of it. And that has been a practice in many European countries, at least since then, for a very, very long time. And so it's either a portrayal of refugees as in a variety of categories that are in one way or another either delegitimation or dehumanization. And that is either they're not really fleeing danger, they're economic migrants is the first kind of presentation of it. And then it's reduced into further issues, the kinds that you were talking about. They're a threat to integration, to social cohesion, and even a danger in society because they are not really refugees, they're potential threats to security and potential terrorists, etc. So yes, that the variety of that spectrum, I would say it's important to be aware of. It's a complex form of delegitimation and dehumanization in different countries that plays to a certain kind of political agenda that is increasingly important in the political realities of very, very many countries. And that was the point I was trying to raise. Whether or not that's addressing one problem or two problems, I don't know. I see them as two sides of the same coin, to be honest, rather than two separate problems, but we can agree to disagree in the presentation of the issue. So I'm not disagreeing that there's an element of dehumanization. I just think it's more historical than just this conflict. But I think also to the point they were saying, yes, there have been material differences in responses to your refugee crisis. Your own situation in Bosnia, there was a very different response to the Bosnian refugee crisis in 1992 and 1993 in relation to a relatively open door policy that we have not seen really in relation to this. And you could argue again that something similar was seen in Ukraine that we have not seen in others. So yes, there are issues around different approaches that one has to explore the reasons for. The issues that I think were mentioned, and I don't know how many, there's one specific question I'll address in a second, but the thing that I think comes through in a number of the points, both from the ambassador and from Khataiba just now in the previous conversation that Dr. Talal was putting forward, I think it does ultimately come down to organization and voice and strength and a unity of voice and a unity of purpose. And I think, as the ambassador was saying, the problem on a very perfunctory analysis is that so far the strength of that voice and the critical weight of that voice has not been sufficient to move interests in the direction that would resolve the crisis or the conflict or the situation inside Syria. How can that be changed? And that's the answer that you are trying to provide today. That is the issue of re-energizing or creating or developing, frankly speaking, some kind of a movement to do that around the issues that we've been talking about today and that are in the report. I do think there is a way of harnessing those interests and that focus and that voice and purpose with some of the interests of a number of states who are at this stage still struggling to work out how to exercise their influence or to pursue their interests. As I think, again, the ambassador was saying, whether or not we like it, what is both a humanitarian and political crisis has to be resolved and will be resolved through political means. It's not just going to be resolved through humanitarian means. And there is a need to understand, as I think you were actually saying when you were presenting your view about one problem, not two, you have to see it. If you're going to be successful in doing that, you have to see things, however much you find it unpalatable or disagree with or whatever, you have to see it through the lens of the people whose interests are, or how they see their interests as well. And you may not agree with it, or you may deprecate it, or you may think it's unfortunate, whatever it is. But the truth of the matter is that asking others to exercise their influence and to support the kinds of outcomes that we're looking at is going to depend on more than simply a moral commitment. There has to be a political interest there that is to be leveraged, and I think we know what that is. I don't want to oversimplify that issue. I'm not saying that's the only issue on the table for European countries. Some of you mentioned in your comments the issues. I think the professor was talking about a statue to Putin. And the indications there and where focus of various countries is now. You know, one of the conversations that we've had a lot over the last 9 or 10 months is to what degree these issues now playing out in Ukraine affect this conflict. And the honest truth is, at best, I think what we can say is we don't know. The interim conclusion is relatively little at the moment in terms of the position of states, at least publicly, in terms of where they think a change may be occurring or an opportunity may be arising. At this stage, it's not clear in any public pronouncements, at least, that states are changing the way in which they're reflecting on the Syrian situation as a result of the Ukrainian situation. At the same time, one expects that behind the scenes, there are at least some conversations going on that say, is there a difference here in the calculus? Is Russia distracted? Is Russia weakened, etc., etc.? And that is something that, frankly, a lot of you on the ground and more connected have a better handle on than some of us. But the reality is, of course, that European states have an interest in that question. So I'm saying it's not just about refugees alone. It's more complicated and more nuanced. But at the moment, it's not at all clear precisely what influence it's practically having on the ground and how that would change. On the third, on the final issue, I think the question Qutaiba has already addressed fairly comprehensively, and I don't think there's much that I can add sensibly to that. I suppose the only issue in reflection on the risks of any solution, and I was mentioning earlier this idea of what was mentioned yesterday as a wicked problem, and many of you know what that means technically. And whether or not this is technically a wicked problem is something the theoreticians can debate. But what is clear is that when trying to resolve things like this, any attempt to resolve it has consequences. It's one of the characteristics of wicked problems, right? That any attempt to resolve it has a consequence. So the four baskets approach, the ultimate failure of that approach, that there's a consequence to that. The pursuit of the Constitutional Committee, the ultimate, I think, let's say, stagnation of that, there's a consequence to that. And any pursuit now of these measures, there will be consequences to it. None of these things are value-free, etc. So I think the point that Qutaiba is pointing out and the question of how those are framed is obviously crucial to be very, very clear-eyed about what the potential consequences are of an approach that if we are in a bit of a void in terms of knowing what the content of any of those proposals are. But what has to be clearly understood, of course, is that whatever is done, whatever is put forward, is of course not consequence-free, and that there has to be, it's absolutely incumbent on the people putting forward those ideas to be very, very clear about what the potential consequences are. So I think that's all I could usefully say about that. Whether or not it goes down the line of what the lady was suggesting really depends on the content of the proposals that we don't know right now. But I think that that's the most I could say, that it's not consequence-free, and the responsibility of those putting forward the ideas, they have to be very clear-eyed about what those consequences would be. And if it's contradictory of the overall principles, then that, of course, would be a problem.
Thank you, Paul. And the final word from Dr. Talal, where do we go from here?
Thank you, Rafiq. I just want to say a couple of words. Those of us who don't read the future and learn from it, as being said, they have lost already a big mean of navigating the future. In 2011, when the Dar'an people, brothers and sisters, went to Bashar ask him, they're not asking for something big. They're asking him for accountability for the one who tortured Hamza al-Khatib and killed Hamza al-Khatib. That's it. They're not asking to topple him, to drag him, to take him to prison, to put down his empire. No, Hamza al-Khatib. Because Bashar learned from his doomed father that you never give up for those people at all. If you give up to them one time, you lost, because you gave them the chance to rise again and ask you again. And that means you already lost. Having said that, let's go back also for what called peace process. And you know who presented the peace process, who produced it to the world? Mr. Kissinger. Mr. Kissinger, at the time they were talking between the Israeli and Palestinian, it's a big problem. So the best way to handle the problem is to solve it on the long run. That one of them will get tired. One of them will get tired. And whoever gets tired first, he lost already. It's already, you could count the years, how many years, over 30 years since the peace process has started. If we are going to start a negotiation with the regime and step to step with what we call it, building confidence and trust, we already lost. If you want to do something, you ask for something big. Get the refugee out of the prison and would like to have all their name, what happened to them, who lost, who you killed, and who left, complete accountability. After we have complete accountability of that, we maybe sit down and talk to you. Before that, for paper, for passport, for renewal, no, we're not gonna do that. The second one, and I'll say, this is again an opportunity. And I'm not sure that this opportunity to come to us, you and me in the future, I'm not sure. It may come to your children or your children's children, God forbid. But I'm not sure it will come to me and you. If we don't take this opportunity now and act, I'm not saying to read what we've done, to read what we talk, and I said to act on it and put yourself responsible for it. You're not responsible for it, all of it, but all of us collectively responsible for it. I have a responsibility, you have a responsibility, and you have a responsibility. And each one of us take his responsibility seriously. If we do that, I think we'll succeed. In the next few hours, and especially in the evening, you've been told to have, I've been told there is some kind of general agreement. There is no group will see eye to eye 100%. There's always a minor change. Don't care about minor changes. Don't make big issue about minor changes, but look at the big goal. If the big goal is clear, is it crystallized to you, if you feel it's compelling, if you agree with it, go for it. Don't lose the opportunity, because that might not come. And if doesn't come, you will be responsible and I'll be responsible. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We have gone much over time. I know that my boss, Rudaina, is going to punish me for it, but I think that the conversation was very important. Without the break, we go into the next session. I invite the moderator, Yasser Al-Farhan, and panelists Linnea Arvidsson, Samer Aldei, Dr. Abdul Hamid Awak, and Nerma Jelacic to come to the panel. Thank you. And thank you to our panelists on Zoom, Kutaiba and Dr. Yasser. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, welcome.